Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Unpacking Islamophobia. Today we'll be discussing Hindu nationalism, also known as Hindutva, and specifically we'll be looking at Hindu nationalism in the United States, how it functions and how it impacts communities. There's been a lot of discussion and research done on Hindu nationalism in India, where it is the ruling ideology of Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the ruling BJP. But not enough attention has been given to Hindu nationalism abroad. So in the US, there have been instances of Hindu nationalism, such as there was the presence of a bulldozer, which in India has been used by the BJP to target Indian Muslims. And this bulldozer was present at a parade marking Indian Independence Day in New Jersey. And the presence of this ideology amongst the diaspora has also caused intra-community conflict amongst Indian American Hindus and Indian American Muslims. And one of the reports we'll talk about today specifically looks at this issue. Also, in the past few months, there's been several reports published about one particular organization in the US, the Hindu American Foundation, and its alleged connections to Hindu nationalism and the BJP. We'll be discussing one of these reports titled HAF, Way to Supremacy, published by We Are Severa in this episode as well. Now to introduce our two wonderful guests, we have Safa Ahmed, who is the Director of Media and Communications for the Indian American Muslim Council, and Pranay Somayajula, who is the Director of Organizing and Advocacy at Hindus for Human Rights. Thank you both for joining us today, and I'll begin by discussing IAMC's recent survey report on the effects of Hindu nationalism on Indian American Muslims. This is for Safa. In the spring of 2024, IAMC and Rethink Media conducted a community survey of 950 Indian American Muslims to assess their perceptions of Hindu nationalism and its impact on their lives in the US. What were some of the key findings of the survey?
Thanks so much, Mobashra. I want to start by making clear, first of all, that IAMC actually conducted the survey because we've been hearing a lot of anecdotal reports for quite some time now, but especially in the past couple of years since 2019 about how the emboldening of the far-right government in India is actually impacting the diaspora overseas. So in some cases, you have people who are more openly showing their Hindu supremacist ideology and some people who are more affected by it now more than ever. So in terms of who was surveyed, we talked to a lot of people who actually have been longtime members, active members in the Indian American community, despite religion. And they've been increasingly noticing that some people, some of their Hindu friends, their coworkers, their colleagues, loved ones even, have been starting to treat them a bit differently. They've been noticing a shift in the atmosphere, a shift in the way they feel welcomed. And so that's quite telling when you look at the results of the survey and what the people are saying about how they're feeling, how their how their sense of belonging has changed in the Indian American diaspora. As for the stats specifically, 80% of respondents stated they feel less comfortable in Indian American spaces since the rise of India's Bharatiya Janata Party, which is the far-right party that currently rules India, with Prime Minister Narendra Modi at the head. 81% of respondents reported experiencing some form of harassment, discrimination, or prejudice from Hindu friends or social contacts in the past decade. 70% reported experiencing similar treatment from Hindu colleagues at work, and the experiences range from social exclusion to direct harassment. 48% of respondents reported harassment on social media, including Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And 86% of respondents see Hindu nationalism as a threat to democracy in the United States, with concerns about the infiltration of Hindu nationalist ideology into US politics and academia.
Those are really, really scary statistics, given that it's not some sort of 10%, 20%. These are vast majority. So it really kind of demonstrates the atmosphere that we're living in and the intra-community issues that are arising from an ideology abroad that's having an impact on, Americans at home. So there have been several incidents in the US. One of them I mentioned in the introduction, where symbols associated with Hindu nationalism have been publicly displayed at events. And these displays have particularly impacted Indian Muslims who no longer feel included in Indian American spaces. How has this Hindu nationalism in the US impacted the relationship between Indian American Muslims and Hindus?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the bulldozer because that was one very prominent example of these Hindu nationalist symbols or celebrations being incorporated into what would normally be like a cultural celebration or just a celebration of Indian American identity. But there have also been several other cases, like very recently in August of this year, there was a Indian Independence Day parade in New York that was slated to have a float that celebrated the building and consecration of a temple on the ruins of a historic mosque. So these things are happening more and more frequently, maybe not at the scale that it always makes the national news, but it does make Muslim Americans feel more isolated and driven out from Indian American spaces. And so when we say 80% of respondents feel less comfortable in these spaces, we're talking really specifically about these community events, these spaces where normally you would have a lot more cohesion, especially before the rise of the BJP. But it also results in a mental and emotional toll on Indian American Muslims just from the impact of seeing the people who they share a culture with, they want shared closeness with, kind of drifting away. And to be clear, this is not all Hindu Americans. We always like to make that clear, especially from IAMC's viewpoint. We work very closely with a lot of Hindu American allies, but there is this sense among Indian American Muslims that they're not quite wanted in these spaces where there might be a larger percentage of people supporting Modi's policies, supporting the BJP, whether or not they support Modi for the reasons of, economic development, et cetera, whatever reasons they might use for whatever reasons they might have for supporting Modi. In the end, for Indian Muslims, Indian American Muslims included, this translates to you don't care enough about our safety or our family's safety. And so the mental and emotional toll this enacts is quite severe in some cases. So respondents in our survey reported feelings of isolation and fear and emotional fatigue. And they really honed in on this point that they had Hindu friends, colleagues, neighbors, people that they were once comfortable with who started to change their behavior towards their Muslim friends. And they reported losing these friends to Hindu nationalist ideology, which, it really heightens the sense that Indian American Muslims don't belong. And when you see that in the context of the broader climate of anti-Muslim bigotry in the United States, particularly in this moment, that ends up making Indian American Muslims specifically, feeling more isolated than ever.
You said that the survey also noted that nearly half of the respondents reported experiencing harassment on social media. How do online platforms contribute to discriminations? And were you able to find that there were certain platforms that were more problematic than others?
Yeah, so the culprits here are the same as always. We have Facebook, WhatsApp, Reddit, Twitter. LinkedIn was a bit surprising, but the respondents reported that on pretty much every major social media platform, they had experienced some form of discrimination or harassment. But the use of social media platforms to harass and intimidate Indian Muslims is nothing new. There was a report called Islamophobia in the Digital Age by the Islamic Council of Victoria that found that between 2019 and 2021, the highest concentration of anti-Muslim tweets in the world came out of India, with over 870,000 hateful social media posts, which is 3 times more than the amount of hate that came out of the US in the same time period. So what's important to remember when looking at that data is that these posts don't just stay in India. Indian American Muslims see them too. They're forwarded in WhatsApp groups. They're in your Instagram comments. They're on Twitter, just being circulated. These include things like gore and snuff films. And these things circulate unchecked on platforms like Meta specifically. So the well-known Facebook whistleblower Francis Haugen listed India as one of the many countries that allowed this kind of proliferation and amplification of anti-Muslim hatred. So these messages of discrimination and violence are affecting us regardless of where we are in the world.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the Australia report because being here in London, in England, we witnessed it was last year, I believe, the Leicester riots that happened, and the riots happened a major part of it was the disinformation online, especially on X. And when there was a study done, it found the vast majority of those tweets actually came from India that were like spreading just false information, claiming that Muslims were out targeting Hindus and whatnot. And it actually created violence on the streets here in England. So it shows you just like how vast the impact is of something that's coming out from another country impacting real life in another country. And then my last question to you, what specific policy actions does the report recommend for tackling Hindu nationalism's effects in the US?
With regards to policy specifically, and with recent events, this recommendation is not looking likely to be implemented anytime soon, unfortunately, but there needs to be greater effort to address the issue of hate speech and radicalization against minorities in online spaces just across the board. Online hate is one of the main ways that Hindu supremacists outside of India are able to not just harass Indian American Muslims, but also to propagate their harmful worldview as well, to connect with other people who might share that anti-Muslim bigotry, to kind of convene to create this alliance between different strains of the far right globally. And Pranay will talk more about that in a little bit. But you see Indian Hindu supremacists, including Indian Hindu supremacists in the United States, who are more and more closely working with white supremacists, giving audiences to white supremacists and Zionists and amplifying their strains of Islamophobia or anti-Muslim bigotry as well. So online regulation of these platforms is absolutely vital. But beyond that, there needs to be education at all levels, not just for policymakers, just to talk about what Hindu supremacy is, what it looks like, but also at the community level, because unfortunately, there is still very little mainstream recognition of the fact that Hindu supremacy is a threat. And not just that it is a threat, but a threat with the amount of, circulation globally that we're seeing right now. Those things you can turn to Severa, which is, kind of leading towards what Pranay is talking about. But IAMC is one of the core organizations, along with our partners like Hindus for Human Rights, that works on the Severa Coalition. And we've done a great deal of research on these topics of Hindu supremacy, how it networks with the multiracial far right in the US and globally. And from there, we are hoping to see that there is more recognition, more education, and just more willingness to tackle the problem of Hindu supremacy at every level, be it community, government, education.
Thank you, Safa. And that's a perfect segue into discussing the next report with Pranay about HAF, Hindu American Foundation, and it's the report from We Are Severa, which is HAF Ways to Supremacy. Pranay, can you provide a brief overview for our listeners of the HAF and what role it plays in the global Hindutva movement?
Absolutely. This is a great question. And thank you so much to Safa for really, I think, setting this up very nicely. I think when we talk about HAF or the Hindu American Foundation, I think it's important to understand that it is the and part of a new generation of a much older and much longer movement. And what I mean by that is and the Severa report, Halfway to Supremacy, really digs into this in more detail about how the early leaders of the Hindu American Foundation, which the group was founded in 2003, but many of its early leaders and co-founders, most of whom are still very involved as board members or as senior staff in the organization to this day, actually cut their teeth in older right-wing Hindu groups, particularly the VHPA, or the Vishwa Hindu Parishad of America, which has been, I know, the focus of a fact sheet from the Bridge.Initiative, and also has been the focus of Severa's two previous reports that were released earlier this year. And the VHPA is, as folks know, is the American wing of the VHP, which is a Hindu supremacist extremist group in India. And the VHPA, which was founded in the 70s in the US, was very much identified with the politics of India. It was very much engaged in the day-to-day political issues in India, and it had that reputation. And there are, and our report talks about this, but there are publicly available emails from internal VHPA listservs from the 90s and early 2000s where you see names like Mihir Meghani and Rishi Buttada and others, folks who would go on to co-found Hindu American Foundation, having long exchanges with the VHPA leaders about how the VHPA is too identified too closely with Indian politics. It needs to do. We need a Hindu organization in the U.S. that can sort of be seen as more independent, that can be seen as identifying with the interests of the Hindu American community in the diaspora. And so that is why they founded Hindu American Foundation, essentially to give a the sort of the veneer of a younger new generation taking leadership, give the veneer of more sort of mainstream respectability and legitimacy as a voice of the Hindu American community. And that is really what sets Hindu American Foundation apart. Now, of course, they have, and the report goes into this. I know we'll talk about it more in this conversation. The substance of HAF's work, especially in recent years, has really been to essentially launder a Hindu supremacist agenda in the U.S. But their sort of stated purpose, and that has inflected the way they message, the sort of aesthetics they use, the way they present themselves outwardly, particularly to an audience who isn't as familiar with them. That sort of core idea has always been to project an additional degree of independence and an additional degree of separation from the politics of Hindu supremacy in India.
Thank you, Pranay, for that very important historical overview. And the report also outlines a number of ways in which HAF has engaged in anti-Muslim bigotry, including working with far-right actors such as Middle East Forum, which Bridge, we have a fact sheet on them. Why do you think, or why does the report find, why does HAF engage with anti-Muslim voices, and what's the strategic goal here?
That's a great question. And I think there's a couple dimensions to this. So on the one hand, this idea of Hindu supremacist groups cooperating and coordinating with and engaging with other far right spaces and other far right actors is not limited to HAF. And our first Severa report in particular details how the VHPA's network here in the US and its affiliates have publicly aligned themselves with all sorts of far right hate groups, including many anti-Muslim groups that have been designated as anti-Muslim hate groups by the SPLC. And so the fact that HAF has sort of thrown its lot in with groups like the Middle East Forum and other anti-Muslim groups, it's not surprising in that sense. And I think the reason why HAF in particular has done this is to sort of drive a wedge between Hindu Americans and Muslim Americans and Sikh Americans and other sort of like Middle Eastern, South Asian American communities who, in the aftermath of 9/11, when all of our communities sort of responded to the increasing prejudice and surveillance and targeting that we face, we responded to that by building these bonds of solidarity, right? Identifying in a more sort of all-encompassing way as Bamemsa communities, South Asian communities, and yes, identifying with our religious practices, but also recognizing that there is a broader overarching way in which we are all similarly racialized and othered in this country. And that was really important to the sort of organizing and activism that happened in our communities after 9/11. But that is so thoroughly at odds with the Hindu supremacist project that sees Muslims and others as inferior, sees them as threats. And so that is ultimately why is HAF plays an important role in trying to drive this wedge by spreading anti-Muslim and anti-Sikh conspiracy theories and bigotry and hate, which leads to precisely the sort of, I think, like phenomena that Safa identified at the sort of the level of what the polling and statistics are telling us about how people are feeling in this country. And so that's, I think, a really important thing that HAF and other Hindu supremacist groups have done, is to do that while also doing this, spreading this hate and division in the name of protecting Hindu Americans. HAF and the HAF report from Severa really tries to elucidate this in great detail, the way that this organization presents itself to this day as a civil rights organization. They're a member of the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. They are really trying to gain legitimacy in mainstream liberal civil society by saying we stand for the rights of Hindu Americans. And the vision of what Hindu American rights mean to them that they present is a zero-sum vision in which our well-being and our safety and our security as a Hindu American community must necessarily come at the expense of the well-being and safety and security of Muslim communities or other communities who are deemed as sort of the enemy by Hindu supremacist ideology. And that's really dangerous, especially at a time when we are seeing an increased upsurge of white Christian nationalism in this country. It's absolutely true that as a religious minority, Hindu Americans do face a significant threat right now. But that threat isn't coming from anti-caste activists. It's not coming from Muslim Americans. It's not coming from the quote unquote radical left. It's coming from the white Christian nationalism, and that movement that is now about to take power again in January. And the fact that we've seen the ways in which groups like HAF are also really aligning themselves with and gearing up to collaborate closely with the incoming Trump administration. The HAF's executive director, Sir Hag Shukla, even referred to the organization's policy agenda as a Hindu Project 2025. That was her word. Those her words that she used. And I think that really says something about this very short-sighted alignment with a white Christian nationalist project in the name of supposedly protecting our communities is something that very much informs the anti-Muslim posturing of these groups, and something it's a dangerous sort of phenomenon that I think we should take very seriously.
Yeah, you mentioned caste as you were responding to my previous question, and the report discusses caste as one of the issues with the HAF, and it found that HAF actively opposed laws that specifically protect against caste discrimination, and I believe a lot of this happened in California. Can you tell our audience a little bit about caste and how HAF's engagement with this issue shapes their broader alignment with the far right?
Absolutely. So as folks may know, the caste system is a millennia old system of social hierarchy and oppression that exists not just in South Asia, it exists in communities all over the world. But when we often talk about the caste system, we're usually talking about the caste system in the Indian subcontinent, that sort of divides society into a certain number of groups that are arranged hierarchically. At the very top are Brahmins, and then you have folks at the bottom of this hierarchy, and then people who are deemed so far below it they're outside the hierarchy altogether. These are Dalits, or who previously known as untouchables, and this is where the practice of untouchability comes from. It's a deep, I can't stress enough what a deeply violent and oppressive social system it is, and one that, even though it's been officially, people will often say, oh, caste has been officially outlawed in India, it still exists. It exists both in very overt violent ways and also in more subtle and microaggressive ways as well throughout Indian society. It is very much baked into like a lot of the sort of cultural norms, and it's important to acknowledge that the caste system as it's practiced in India does have its roots in a lot of Hindu scriptures. And this is just a reality that we have to deal with. It is because it's tied up in these religious notions of purity and impurity. And so the ways that like right-wing Hindu groups deal with this is, well, there's a few things. One, there's been a large movement, particularly in the last 100 years or so, for caste oppressed peoples to turn away from Hinduism, embrace Buddhism and other religions in India. That's very inconvenient to the Hindu right wing because they need those numbers in order to construct this nationalist majority. So there's this bit in India, there's this concerted effort by the Hindu supremacist movement to sort of try and deny caste and sort of bring caste oppressed people back into the Hindu fold in a very coercive way. And then here in the diaspora, what that looks like is this sort of denial of caste in the sense of downplaying the reality of it, downplaying the significance, saying, oh, caste, to the extent that it exists, it doesn't even exist in the diaspora. We left that behind when we immigrated, and you're Hindu phobic for talking about caste because you're claiming that all Hindus are oppressors. Well, first of all, there are many anti-caste Hindus. I'm one of them. Hindus for Human Rights is full of them. And this idea that like, you have to be Hindu requires you to identify with victimhood in this way by saying feeling victimized by anyone talking about the reality of caste. We know that caste exists in the diaspora. We have cases of discrimination in employment and housing and other cases. People talk about the ways they have been made to feel marginalized and othered on the basis of caste in diasporic communities. And the Hindu right groups like HAF try to completely deny and erase this, and not only to do that, but also to portray any mention of it as some sort of fundamental threat. And they use this idea of Hindu phobia as a sort of a weapon to silence anyone who speaks out against Hindu supremacy, anyone who criticizes them, anyone who criticizes the Indian government, and anyone who talks about caste as a reality that needs to be confronted in the diaspora. And it's really ironic that, like I said earlier, HAF presents itself as a civil rights organization, and yet they have repeatedly tried to kill, and unfortunately successfully in some cases, killed landmark civil rights legislation. The bill in California that would have outlawed caste discrimination, which overwhelmingly passed both houses of the state legislature and then was vetoed by the governor after a really concerted pressure campaign by Hindu right-wing groups like HAF. That bill would have amended California's civil rights law. And so this idea that you can be a civil rights organization, be in spaces like the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, but then try to not just like raise concerns about, but actively try to kill civil rights legislation that would outlaw a form of discrimination that we know exists is really telling, I think, of the sort of the real agenda behind the way groups like HAF position themselves. And caste is really an important, I think, it's a really important, it's been a really important rallying point for them because they have, I think, convinced large sections of the Hindu American community, and I've anecdotally I've seen this just in my own community, but they've convinced large sections of the community that you are under attack because people are talking about fighting caste discrimination, which is just it's patently ridiculous. But unfortunately, I think it has become a salient political narrative they've been able to inject that we, particularly as a Hindu organization at Hindus for Human Rights, are very actively trying to push back against.
Thank you for that overview again. I know there's so much there to unpack. But I also wanted to talk about HAF and its connections. I think this was a big part of the report, connections or support for the BJP. HAF is a US based organization, but it has staunchly defended and supported India's ruling BJP and its policies, a number of which have disenfranchised Indian Muslims. And last month there was an article in Al Jazeera by Mukta Joshi, and they did a deep dive on HAF as well, and specifically its advocacy for the BJP. Noting that its actions bring up the question of whether the organization should register as a foreign agent under the Foreign Agents Registration Act of 1938. What did your report find regarding HAF and its alleged connections to the BJP?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot to unpack there. I mean, I think in terms of like what we know from the report and from other investigations like Mukta Joshi's piece in Al Jazeera is that yes, HAF is a 501(c)(3) organization. They are independent. And they make a big deal out of this. That they have no connections to any other organizations, no official affiliations or anything like that, or political parties or anything like that. That is true on paper. We also know that if you look at the substance of how of HAF's advocacy, its policy work, et cetera, there's been like a sort of recurring and consistent trend of essentially parroting whatever the BJP line is on any issue relating to India, whether we're talking about the Ram Mandir in Ayodhya, whether we're talking about the Citizenship Amendment Act, the stripping of autonomy from Kashmir, the on and on and on. HAF has always advocated for a position that would be beneficial to Modi and the BJP government. I mean, HAF and its leaders even were very critical of and really advocated and lobbied hard against the in the 2000s when Modi was denied a visa by the US State Department because of his role in the 2002 anti-Muslim pogrom in Gujarat. HAF was then a fledgling organization, was involved in trying to sort of lobby against that visa ban and to sort of defend and whitewash Modi's religious freedom record. And that's been a recurring trend. We've seen HAF be listed as a welcome partner for I think all of Modi, I'm pretty sure all of Modi's visits to the US, whenever he's done a big rally in Indian American communities during state visits in 2014 and 2019, and most recently this year, HAF is listed as a welcome partner on the brochure. Their leadership are involved in the planning and welcome committees for these events, and again, including as recently as Modi's September rally on Long Island. And so we know that there is very clearly an alignment there. That said, I should say, and the report mentions this explicitly, that ultimately the idea of a FARA designation or registration under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, that's legal designation. And as a research, the purpose of a research report is to educate about the facts and provide analysis, but we're not really in a position to make that determination about, should a HAF register as a foreign agent or not. I'm not a lawyer, and I don't, and that's just sort of beyond the scope of this particular report. But I do think that this report and the investigation from Al Jazeera and other sort of evidence that has come out in recent years does point us in the direction of is that we should be asking questions about why is this group that claims to be advocating for Hindu American interests so tied up in defending the policies and the reputation of a foreign government. And this is something that even, the report talks about. There was one instance when HAF was mobilizing support to send emails to Congress opposing a resolution that was criticizing Modi's religious freedom record. And I think in 2014, again, there are like listserv emails where Mihir Meghani, the co-founder and board member of HAF, was sending this out, asking people to support. And he gets an email back from a leader of another Hindu organization who's essentially saying, I'm not going to support this because what does this have to do with Hindu Americans? Why do you care about this? The HAF it's a Hindu American foundation focused on Hindu Americans. And I think that, that episode, which is detailed in the report, is very, very illustrative of the ways that HAF has used this sort of Hindu American label to justify or hide behind or to hide the extent of its lobbying and advocacy in support of the Modi regime's priorities.
Thank you. Thank you both for this super informative episode. I think this topic is something that has been simmering in the background, and it's at least here in England, it's a topic that's kind of manifests when something big happens. And I know in the US, when there's certain incidences, like the bulldozer incident that made the media, there's some sort of discussion on it, but I feel like there's not enough attention being given to this issue. And like both of you alluded, with the incoming new administration, I reckon that there's going to be a need to discuss it further and the power that it holds and its connections to other far-right ideologies. So I want to thank both of you for joining us today, and we will be linking the reports in the description bar, so please do check it out. Yeah, thank you so much. And everyone, please tune in to our next episode. Have a wonderful day, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Mobashra. This was great.